Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, very successfully we are running a series on gender and education. Friends, today in this session we would be discussing on women education in colonial India. We have discussed the topic in our previous sessions also, and this is the third part in the series where we would be discussing on women education in colonial India. And today specifically we would be discussing on the legacy of colonial education policy, and for this discussion we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Bip. Dr. Shruti Bip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV, Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Bip has presented numerous papers and a number of articles have been published in reputed journals. She is a prolific and dynamic professor who believes in giving most of her knowledge to the students. Therefore, through these live lectures, she shares knowledge with you. Friends, if you want to ask questions from Dr. Shruti Bip on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. All friends are requested to call in the last 10 minutes so that first you could have a deep insight into today's lecture, and afterwards, yes, in last 10 minutes we promise to give answers to your question. So with a warm welcome, we would like Dr. Shruti Bip to continue with our series on gender and education. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Thanks a lot for this wonderful opportunity to carry on the theme that we have started, that is gender and education. Now, the reason we are discussing in greater detail regarding the colonial educational policies, you all must be thinking that we have already done like 2 lectures on this theme, and still there is a lot to discuss. The reason is that one always needs to go to the past to analyze the current trends. So, the prevalent trends in today's education policy definitely can be traced to the kind of educational policies that were prevalent before the contemporary times, even before India's independence. So, it is in that context that we had discussed ancient and medieval India, and then now we are going to discuss the modern Indian historical period, that is the period from 1757 onwards, and the kind of educational discourse that emerged during this period, and how this educational discourse ultimately impacted the gendered issues as they emerged from time to time in education, and also how these issues continue to plague today's educational policy and system also. So, with that brief description, I would like to continue with our discussion, and in today's lecture we would be discussing the regional distribution of educational institutions, both primary, secondary as well as higher educational institutions, and also what was the legacy of colonial educational reforms on specifically on gender issues related to education. So, for this I would be repeatedly referring to some kind of statistical analysis as well, and I would be sharing with you some facts and figures so that you can have a clearer picture as to what went wrong with the issue of female education and why there was a huge gap, a huge gender gap that existed not only at the level of enrollment but also access as well as completion of education at various levels, whether it was primary or middle school or secondary or higher educational institutions. The data of all the pupils in public institutions and all the girls under instruction in both public as well as private institutions according to provinces for specifically for years 1896-97 indicates that the attendance of the girls in schools had increased remarkably over a period of time, and most of this data has been incorporated from the Progress of Education in India reports related to the Education Department of Maharashtra State Archives ranging from 1892-93 to 1896-97. The percentage of increase from 1891-92 was most noticeable in the co-educational schools. Interestingly, there were areas like Coorg and Burma who took the lead in the percentage of girls who were going to public institutions for boys, that is in the co-educational institutions. So it was basically Coorg and Burma who took the lead as far as the participation of girls in co-educational institutions was concerned. Now the issue of co-ed schools was also quite a controversial issue, particularly for late 19th century India, and gradually the popularity of mixed education can be seen from the available data. Next to Coorg and Burma was Madras and Assam, and Bombay and Bengal on the other hand had more than 1/3 of its girls in boys schools. So these also were the regional areas where the issue of co-education in co-educational institutions and girls going uninhibited to such institutions was not a hindrance anymore. Whereas in areas like Punjab and Northwest, the proportion of girls in co-educational schools was very less. It was in fact ranging from 1 to 2%, thereby indicating that there were deep-rooted biases, and the perception was such that girls either needed zenana education or the need was felt for separate educational institutions for the girl students. These extraordinary regional differences were also due to the varying strength of traditional prejudice. The Education Commission condemned co-education at least for children above 7 years of age, and recommended that the attendance of girls in boys' schools should not be encouraged except in places where girls' school could not be maintained. So even the Education Commission that had been appointed by the British government was also of the opinion that girls probably would do better in separate educational institution, and there was no need to encourage their participation in co-educational institutions, and it was only in exceptional circumstances that girls could access such educational institutions, particularly in those areas where it was not feasible or practical to have separate educational institutions for them. So therefore, with these kind of biases and inhibitions that were even held by the so-called modern colonial state, the issue of problematic access of girls to educational institutions remained intact. Then it would also be interesting to look at the distribution of girls in various educational institutions stage-wise. So the distribution of girls in secondary and primary schools according to the stages of instruction for the several provinces in 1896-97 shows that out of the 550 girls studying in high school, as many as 215 were from Bombay. Now this again can be traced to greater interest shown by a Parsi population which was probably staying in and around Bombay, who did not have much inhibitions in sending their girls to schools and even to co-educational institutions. So therefore, a community's perceptions, ideas, their patriarchal mindset, all these had deep implications on whether the girl child of the family would be accessing schooling or not. And here a very good example that I have just given is that from the Bombay region, where there were many Parsi families who were quite broad-minded, and they had no inhibitions in sending their girls to such co-educational institutions. The number of girls in the middle school stage was 3,998, of whom no less than 2,399 were in Madras. So again, South India and particularly Madras region had a clear edge over the other regional areas and other provinces as far as access to educational institutions for girls was concerned. So therefore, the reason these port cities were kind of excelling in the issue of female education, or they were exceeding other areas, outstripping other areas in girls' access to educational institution. The reason could be early control of these areas and early establishment of administrative centers in these areas by the newly emerging colonial regime from 1757 onwards. Then in the upper primary stage, the number was approximately 20,000, and chiefly such educational institutions whose data has been incorporated in the Progress of India education reports related to Bombay, Madras and Burma. And it is only when we come to lower primary A and lower primary B that the number of girls became really large, and it became so large that it was in fact noticeable. So therefore, a similar kind of trends could be seen even in colonial India, the kind of trends that are available today, that we have greater female enrollment in the lower levels of education, in the lower stages of education, basically primary and middle schools, and even in secondary education. And as one moves the ladder, particularly with reference to rural participation of girls in education, we see a deep divide that exists between the higher educational enrollment patterns and the lower level educational patterns. So similar pattern could be noticed even during 19th and 20th century, where girls' access was noted more in the lowest level of education, that is the primary education, as compared to the higher levels of education. And this increase again was especially noticeable in Eastern Bengal and Assam, whereas areas like Coorg, then central provinces, that is Berar and Bengal, they were still lagging behind even in the enrollment of girls in primary level of education. Now, continuing with our discussion on the kind of data that has been gathered for this period and which has been made use of by educationists, if one minutely observes the data, one finds out that the number of girls enrolled in various institutions kept on increasing continuously over the years. That is, from 1922 to 1947, there was definitely 3 to 4 times increase in the enrollment, as you can see from the figures. And the trend about female education was encouraging, and it was also specifically becoming quite popular from 1920s to 1940s. Again, a fact that can be attributed to the national movement and to the active role played by Mahatma Gandhi. The development, though, was again confined to certain regional areas, particularly the urban areas, because most of women's education was looked after by private organizations and private enterprise who were mostly active in urban areas. The rural areas were largely ignored, and again this trend has continued even after independence, where one sees a paucity of good educational institutions in rural areas, whereas more than 60% of India still lives in the rural areas. So the same anomalies that in the educational sector that were there during the colonial period have continued, and the trend really needs to be challenged now, and the government needs to devise ways and means and policies that there is an equitable distribution of educational institutions in both the rural and urban areas, and it is not that only those who can afford to migrate to urban centers and to spend thousands or lakhs of rupees on getting access to a good quality education. Even only they can afford, and this is particularly a problem with the females of the household, because the parents, while they are ready to invest huge amounts for their son's education, they rarely do that for their daughter's education for reasons that I have discussed elsewhere. Now coming to the issue of government agencies. The government educational agencies also could not reach the rural areas both in the colonial as well as in the post-colonial period, a fact that has been attested to by the kind of data that has been collected. Mahatma Gandhi also had specific views regarding women education, which brought about a change not only in the activities of the females. They were kind of incorporated in the public domain. They were allowed to participate in the public domain, and in their education and their occupational training was also now being talked about more openly, and also with some kind of recognition being given, because their participation in the public domain was considered as a part of their duty and service to the motherland. But again, the rural areas were not really forthcoming, and most of the participation was limited to the urban centers. Now, having discussed this very briefly, this regional kind of implications of colonial education policy, now I would be discussing with you as to what were the motives of colonial education policy, because only when we analyze these motives in greater detail and also with some kind of a critical analysis, that can we derive the real meaning of the term gender and education, because most of the gender issues that we see today in our educational policy, they can very well be traced to the past, and particularly the way a modern system of education was replicated on India. The way modern education system did not emerge out of Indian requirements or the needs and the benefits for Indian population, but they were largely geared to the requirements of the colonial state. While girls' education registered a definite expansion during the colonial period, we cannot ascertain that the curriculum was satisfactory for the girls. The spread of English education by the British was not out of generosity. Rather, there were specific motives. That the reason with which Britishers introduced a new education system in India was not out of any kind of benevolence or any kind of concern for the so-called backward Indian society. Rather, there were clear-cut religious, political, administrative, economic issues that forced them, and in fact they had no option but to spend some money, some limited amount on educating Indians so that all these motives could be met. For example, when we say religious, then obviously a motive was proselytization, that is conversion, because only English education was considered as a very important vehicle to convey the ideas of Bible and to kind of brainwash Indians and also make them aware of this whole new philosophy that was available for them, and which would also give them greater opportunities in the colonial regime. Then as far as moral, the Britishers had this, they were great believers in the idea of racial superiority, and they considered Indians to be morally quite inferior to them. So therefore, they wanted Indians to be aware of Western liberal Christian ideas, principles, practices, concepts, and therefore it was considered important to introduce this new kind of English education, not only medium but also new kind of subjects which would make Indians aware of the whole new world that existed outside. Then when we talk about administrative motive, a clear motive was to create a class of cheap clerks or to create a class of bureaucrats who could be employed cheaply and who would be very loyal and obedient and subservient to the colonial regime, and in fact they would ultimately become bulwarks for the empire. So therefore, to staff the vast and elaborate bureaucracy, they needed to devise a new education policy. Then when we come to economic motives, then a very clear-cut economic motive was to familiarize the Indians with the modalities as well as values of the capitalist economic system, of the profit motive, of industrial revolution, of industrialization, and how it was the British factories which needed more and more raw materials in order to churn out the finished products which would then be shipped to the colonies like India, and here there was a need to create a readily available market for British manufactured goods. So therefore trade and all those requirements that come with trading houses and a demand for British products, a change in tastes, values and morals, all this was also being called for. And when we come to political motives, then of course it is the reason was to consolidate and maintain their dominance in the country, and there was no other better way to do so than through education, than through their kind of educational policy, their kind of subjects, their kind of medium. And when all this would be replicated, then obviously Indians would start accepting the British rule in a more positive and in a more happy manner. So it was considered as a very important part of their overall legacy and of their overall strategy of successfully ruling the country for many more years to come. Now, while all these were the motives, these motives did not really benefit Indians. And this can further be explained by describing what were the weaknesses of colonial education system. Now, when we talk about weaknesses, the most important point that comes to my mind is that colonial education was not about mass education to begin with, because the East India Company was basically a trading company which had ultimately gained political power in India, and their prime motive was to earn more and more profit and to extract maximum revenue from the country. So therefore, the idea of mass education never struck them, and their only concern was that a small class of English educated Indians should emerge out of the millions and should serve as the interpreters. By interpreters, I mean to serve as a link between the colonial regime and the Indian masses. So this small class, according to Macaulay, who had declared in his famous Macaulay's Minute in 1835, this small class would be English in tastes, in opinions, in morals and in intellect. So therefore, they really never cared for the education of masses, and they really never cared for transforming Indian society or modernizing Indian society by popularizing the idea of free and compulsory education, or by championing the cause of mass education. As a result, the masses remained largely illiterate, and it was only a handful of Indians, the elite class, who were able to afford this costly kind of education, that they were able to access these new educational institutions that were being championed by the Britishers. As a result, the number of Indians who had access to cheaper version of education or schooling further declined during the colonial period. Because if we compare and contrast the data of pre-1757 and post-1757 period, then we realize that the number of ashrams and tolls and pathshalas that were prevalent and whose doors were more or less open for the local community, the village community, that trend rather declined. And once these tolls, pathshalas, etc. were shut, then the number of Indians who had access to schooling further decreased. So instead of any kind of improvement, there was rather a decrease in the number of Indians who were educated or literate, at least for 3 to 4 decades after the establishment of the colonial period. The knowledge and the values that were to be taught by the British through their new education system were primarily to be Western in nature and were eventually used to stabilize the Raj. So therefore, the political motive, even if it was not being openly declared or it was not imagined, definitely was there at the back of their mind. And the British started a system of education in India on the basis of the system that existed in their mother country, that is Britain. So therefore, the education system was completely alien, it was different. The language also championed by them was different, and therefore for a couple of years and for a long time there were many Indians who were not comfortable, who were not versatile enough to accept this new education system that had been imposed. And most of the emphasis was on the language on English, and the knowledge of English became very important for people who wanted to occupy official positions as well as leadership roles. So therefore, a new kind of epithet that was based on the knowledge of a particular language, which was an alien language, developed, and this was all the more a problem for the female students, because as it is, the access of females to the public domain, to educational institutions that were co-educational institutions, was limited. And another problem that was associated with lower access to schooling was the issue of English language being the medium of instruction, which further deprived females from gaining access to that kind of education. Now, another issue that I would be discussing is again related to the regional aspect, that is the neglect of the rural areas. For now, I shall be taking a brief break and will be joining soon. Thank you.
With this note, we would like to thank Dr. Shruti Vip for giving us a productive session. And friends, we would be meeting again after a very short break. So keep watching us. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. And friends, as you know that we are talking on women education in colonial India. We hope that you might have learnt a lot from previous session. In this session also we are going to give you the in-depth knowledge. For this session also we would like to welcome once again our guest Dr. Shruti Webb. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Geetika. Thanks a lot for this opportunity once again. So we were basically discussing weaknesses of the colonial education policy, and in that context I was telling you as to how there were certain regions that were completely neglected as far as development of educational opportunities was concerned, and rural areas can clearly be described as such neglected areas. So most of the educational institutions were located in urban areas as they were within the reach of the British government, and also because these areas were well populated and probably they had a better hinterland as far as the students were concerned. The rural areas on the other hand were not only neglected but also very little attention was paid to the kind of curriculum that should be there for education of the natives. With the adoption of English as the medium of instruction, the vast mass of the people who were mostly rural folksmen, they were progressively estranged from the administrative, judicial, legal, commercial institutions that were established by the British. So there came to exist a huge divide between the rural and the urban population. So while the urban population still had access to some educational institutions that were now being devised by the Britishers from time to time, and even the educated Indian philanthropists were also kind of establishing such educational institutions, and from 1875 onwards Arya Samaj and then the DAV movement, they also championed the cause of female education, but most of these initiatives were coming about in the urban centers. So therefore the neglect of the neglect of the rural areas began from there, and in fact it has continued till date, that whenever there is an issue of development or emergence of university or setting up of educational institutions, it is always the urban areas or the newly emerging towns, etc., which take the lead, and the rural areas rather they remain neglected and underdeveloped. Villagers during the colonial period were neither able to understand the new kind of institutions as they were emerging, because the medium of instruction as well as business in these new institutions was mostly English. And so they were neither able to understand the modalities of operation, and they were also forced to depend upon those who were well versed in English. So the whole issue of dependence of villagers on people who were well educated, who invariably belonged to urban areas, etc., became a trend. And again here, the impact was could definitely be felt by the rural females. English bestowed unprecedented prestige on the English educated brown sahibs, that is the educated Indians, and because of their link up with the colonial economic and political interests, they largely remained alienated from the masses. Again, a tendency that has continued till date. that all the educated, once people become educated, they just migrate, either they go abroad, or even if they are settled in India, they are no longer in touch with their rural roots. So therefore, this complete disjunct between one region from another, the tendency definitely had started in pre-colonial times, and it has continued till date. Then one would also like to talk about the limitations of Indian universities, and how again it was the colonial education policy which was partly to be blamed for all these limitations that could be seen, that could be experienced by the Indians who were trying to access these universities. Most of these universities were modeled on the University of London. The Indian universities, however, were not same in terms of the quality and the kind of knowledge that was given in London University. So here again, there was a deep racial divide that existed. Indian education primarily was not meant to give any kind of technical or scientific boost in knowledge making, and therefore the colonial education policy was particularly specific to a more emphasis on language and social sciences, humanities. So there was a clear cut agenda that was prevalent, that was of promoting English language as well as humanities as a subject, to the complete neglect of science and technology, whereas the university in London was more of a balanced approach towards education, where all branches of education and knowledge were given equal importance. But similar strategy was not adopted as far as universities were concerned in India. Then the excessive emphasis on the mastering of English language again was a problematic because it eclipsed the entire purpose of education. So imbibing of knowledge was no longer important, and even the knowledge or mastery over a subject was no longer important. What was important was mastery over English, and with this kind of superficial and a very technical kind of approach towards education, a lot was left to be unexplained and incomprehensible. So therefore, this incomplete modernization and a lot of gaps that existed between what the pupils were reading and what they were imbibing continued from school times onwards, and even the universities were kind of based on that anomaly. And therefore, this very fact discouraged the experimental and a questioning kind of a mind, a fact that has also been discussed by Aparna Basu as to how most of colonial education was based on the ideas of memorizing, the idea of accepting whatever had been given in the text as it is, rote learning, and very less experimentation was allowed, hardly any experimentation was allowed, and therefore gradually inquisitiveness took a backseat. So there was a simultaneous devaluation of the indigenous languages, indigenous subjects, indigenous knowledge that had been developed over a period of over a span of centuries, and therefore gradually it was a very lopsided kind of a development that set in, which was primarily geared to the needs and requirements of the colonial state. Now, another problem that can be discussed as far as colonial education policy is concerned was the issue of limited opportunities. So even if educational institutions were developing, universities were coming up after 1857, what were these university educated Indians going to do after getting educated? The problem was very limited jobs were available, and this paucity of opportunities, employment opportunities became a major problem to contend with. The curriculum of English education was in tune with the colonial economic and employment policies specifically. So all the higher appointments in almost all the services were rather reserved for the British. So in any case, even the educated Indians, the well-trained Indians who had graduated from Indian universities could not think of eyeing these posts that had been reserved for the Britishers. So therefore, what was in store for them were mostly the clerical jobs or the middle level jobs, and therefore gradually this resulted in a lot of frustration among educated Indians. There was a lack of any concrete ideas for industrialization, which meant limited opportunities for qualified and trained Indians, except perhaps in the lower levels of bureaucracy or in teaching profession. So English education created a large number of unemployables. Since the British rule in India was primarily geared to promote the interests of the mother country, and since industrial revolution had started first of all in Britain and from the last quarter of 18th century, there had gradually been a spread of the factory system and modern kind of industries. Modern day industrialization soon began in Europe and particularly in Britain during the first half of 19th century. So this definitely impacted their policies that they were going to adopt in the colonies. The policy that they had adopted in the colonies like India was to create an economy that would largely be a consumer of British manufactured goods. The British factory goods had to find market, and this market was readily available in India. So for this market to flourish, it was very important that no industrialization would take place in India, and Indians would completely be dependent on the manufactured goods of the British factories. So therefore, when this became the entire, the whole policy of Britishers in the colonies, particularly like India, one can well imagine the gaps that existed in Indian economy. There were very less educational opportunities, there were very less employment opportunities, and even if education came in the way of some lucky Indians, they could not find jobs because industrialization as a policy was ruled out in India, and whatever educational opportunities and whatever employment opportunities were available, they were also very specific and they were also of a very particular kind of a lower level. So therefore, with these limited opportunities available, these opportunities were even lesser for women for obvious reasons. Then English education, therefore, rather than creating greener pastures for both men and women, for some point of time, it rather created a class of unemployable Indians. Now, also one needs to talk about the issue of myth and reality. Myth hereby means the way Britishers had projected India's education system when they came to India. So, what was their idea regarding the pre-colonial education system that was prevalent? This also needs to be understood because this will throw light on the kind of deep-rooted biases that the colonial regime carried and the way Indian education system was projected in a very poor light, which it did not really deserve. A wrong projection by colonial administrators about the Gurukul system of the colonial education being unorganized, being unkempt, and being confined to a privileged minority of upper caste males. This was the kind of idea that was spread by colonial administrators, that why India needed a new kind of education policy, because whatever was existing before the colonial period, the kind of education system that was prevalent in India prior to the Britishers was very unorganized, it was backward, it was rudimentary, there was no well-planned curriculum that existed, and another allegation that they levied was that it was primarily geared to the requirements of upper caste males, whereas the new education system that the Britishers would be introducing would be far more inclusive. It would not be confined to any particular caste and nor to any particular gender. So this was the kind of propaganda that they were indulging in. And they further projected that the British brought in the broad-based educational system with universalistic criteria of enrollment. So they were of the opinion that since they were believers in democracy and in equality, and they did not really distinguish between the upper caste and the lower caste, neither on the basis of male and female. So their educational institutions were far more holistic, they were far more broad-based, and they were far better than the indigenous system of education that was prevalent. But as we have acquired, as we can gather from the data that was acquired for those years, one clearly finds out that even after the colonial regime, education continued to remain the mainstay of particular castes and also communities as well as gender. That is, it was the males belonging to the upper castes who gained maximum benefit out of the new colonial education policy as well as the employment opportunities. So it was more, a rhetoric kind of an idea that the Britishers were championing, and the reality was something different. And rather a closer scrutiny of the archival data that is available for this period, particularly the reports and the minutes that were written by British administrators from time to time, they explored the myth of an underdeveloped pre-colonial education system that was prevalent in India. So therefore, one needs to indulge in a greater research to unearth the kind of education system that was prevalent in pre-colonial period and how the colonial period completely transformed the legacy of that educational system and geared the entire framework to their own benefit. By 1813, the Court of Directors of English East India Company had instructed the provincial governments, the provincial governors, to institute inquiries into the indigenous education in order to bring about some kind of improvement. And based on the reports of various collectors, the governors concluded that not only indigenous schools and colleges were widespread in the 18th century, but also the sex and the caste composition of the students was quite egalitarian. Now, what does this mean? This basically means that students belonging to all the castes, communities and sex, that is both male as well as female, were accessing most of these schools. And this was highlighted by none other than the colonial administrators in course of their research and fact-finding mission, as they had been given this task in 1813 so that they could devise ways and means to bring about some changes in India's education policy. Now, the denigration of the pre-British system of education in the country therefore was deliberately attempted, and there was very, it was more with some hidden assumptions and deep-rooted biases that this kind of message was being conveyed time and again the message that pre-colonial education policy was rather backward, and what was needed was a whole new modern system of new kind of education system that would be introduced by the Britishers. Now, while pre-British India was not dark, it was not backward, but instead as one sees from the reports of various colonial administrators, the system of education was quite well developed, and also it was broad based as well as widespread. That is, it was not limited to few urban areas only, and neither it was limited to a particular caste or community only. The establishment of the British Empire and the pursuit of the colonial economic and political policies, particularly during the first quarter of 19th century, dealt a death blow to that indigenous system of education. And it was not that the indigenous education of system never existed, or that it was weak, or that it was not able to face the competition of the colonial administrators. Rather, as a matter of policy, the tolls and the pathshalas, they were closed down, and in fact most of the tolls and pathshalas were converted into modern day schools that were championed by the colonial regime. And in fact, Henry Harding's policy of giving preference to English educated Indians in government appointments and also giving them various other kind of favors also gave a death blow to the indigenous system of education, because this indigenous system of education was primarily being imparted either in Sanskrit or in vernacular languages. So therefore, now there were no more takers of such education, because ultimately Indians had to find jobs, and these jobs could come their way only through English education. Now, another very interesting issue that needs to be discussed, particularly with reference to women's schooling and female education, is the issue of separate curriculum. Now, in the beginning, when the Britishers came to India, and when they started taking some kind of interest, they realized that the issue of separate curriculum gained a lot of attention of Indians also. So, while the Western style education was introduced by the British initially for boys, but the girls began to study the same curriculum as boys in most of the schools that had been set up by the colonial administrators or by the Christian missionaries. Educated males, however, and particularly the social reformers and also many Indian philanthropists, started objecting to this uniform curriculum that had been devised for both boys and girls by the colonial schools. So therefore, now there was a demand that was coming from Indian males about a separate curriculum for both the boys and the girls, because according to them, the logic was that while the boys had to take to jobs, they had to start earning, they had to earn a livelihood, women on the other hand were not expected to perform such role models. So therefore, their education also should be different, and there was no it was meaningless to expose them to subjects that were never going to help them in life. So this was the beginning of a parochial kind of thinking that had set in, that education of girls and boys should tread different path. And in fact, not only the institutions should be different, rather the curriculum also should be different, and there was no fun in teaching all these kind of subjects like arithmetic, geography, history, science, etc. to girls. They would be better off if they are taught home science based subjects, needlework, hygiene, health, nutrition, etc., because ultimately it was these subjects that were going to help them in their life. So therefore, with this kind of a mindset, the debate regarding separate curriculum started, and by 1882, many people were in favor of a different curriculum, a differentiated curriculum, and the Education Commission of 1882 also declared the same. So therefore, the British colonial regime was hardly, taking a stand to favor gender issues or to favor women, and instead of supporting the cause of women, instead of supporting one kind of education for all, they championed the cause of such parochial mindsets that a very noble cause like education also needs to be based on gender issues. So the schools particularly which received government grants were required to follow the government established curriculum. The private schools were allowed to teach additional or new subjects which were now offered specially to girls for imparting them a very good kind of a training in domestic affairs so that they would become more responsible wives and mothers. So even education would not expose them to a new life, rather would further relegate them into the domestic sphere, into the private sphere. Rather, education was popularized with the idea that this would create better equipped wives and mothers. The government officials were partly convinced that a curriculum change was desirable, and it was not only desirable for girls but also for the men folk, because only through a new curriculum can they expect wives who would be better trained. So therefore, certain subjects emerged as feminine from mid-19th century onwards. For example, hygiene, domestic work, needlework, singing, home science, etc. Whereas some other subjects like physics, chemistry and mathematics came to described as masculine subjects, thereby further creating a wedge between male and female education. The discussion about the curriculum change was also linked to the level of primary, secondary and higher education. So here also we see that just like in the case of enrollment, there was more enrollment at the primary level. Similarly, at the primary level, it was decided that there was no need for a separate curriculum. But from secondary and higher education onwards, it was emphatically declared that there was no need for girls to study all kind of subjects, and there was special need for girls to study specific kind of subjects in order to make them more feminine, in order to enhance their skills, in order to make them more literate domestically. So therefore, a different curriculum became in vogue, and this was definitely not a very good feature of a modern education system. This was definitely not about democracy, and this was definitely not about equality of rights. But at the college level, if some girls preferred to study even some masculine subjects, they were given some kind of freedom and they could have adopted those subjects also. Now, we are done with our discussion regarding the curriculum, the separate kind of curriculum that was enforced on the female students during the colonial period, and we would be discussing our other features of colonial education and how there were certain backward elements that were attached to the new education system that was being devised in the next lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your precious inputs to the lecture. And friends, you too can give your inputs by giving your feedback at info.cec@nic.in. Your feedbacks, your questions, your suggestions are all welcome. Keep watching us, keep writing us. We would be meeting again and would be discussing more on our series, Gender and Education. Till then, have a nice day. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Giti.